Marcus Webb had approximately 15 minutes of preparation for the most important ceremony in the Sarathine Empire, before his supervisor called to inform him that he was attending in place of Ambassador Chen, who had developed what was diplomatically termed acute gastrointestinal distress, and what was actually termed, "I ate something that is trying to kill me from the inside." "You'll be fine," his supervisor had said with the confidence of someone who wouldn't be there. "Just stand where they tell you, don't touch anything, and for the love of all that's holy, do not speak unless directly addressed by someone with more than 4 honorific titles." So here Marcus stood in the celestial palace of the Sarathine Empire, wearing a formal jacket that didn't quite fit, and surrounded by beings whose lives were measured in centuries, while his species barely managed one. The palace itself was a structure of impossible beauty, crystalline spires that caught light in ways that hurt to look at directly, gardens that floated without visible support, and halls so vast that weather patterns probably formed near the ceilings. The coronation renewal ceremony happened once every 50 years, which meant most of the humans who'd witnessed the last one were dead now. Queen Lyria was reaffirming her vows to serve the Sarathine people, a ritual that involved approximately 6 hours of ceremony that Marcus understood maybe 12% of, and that was being generous with his comprehension. He'd been positioned in the 3rd tier of witnesses, not important enough for the main floor where actual dignitaries stood, but not so unimportant that he was relegated to the observation galleries. It was the diplomatic equivalent of being told, "You can sit with us, but at the kids' table." The ceremony had been progressing for 3 hours. Marcus's feet hurt. His translator implant was overheating from processing 12 simultaneous languages, and he'd lost feeling in his left leg about 40 minutes ago. Around him, beings who'd seen this ceremony multiple times in their long lives stood with the kind of patient endurance that came from measuring time differently than humans did. Queen Lyria stood at the ceremonial platform, radiating authority that made the air feel heavier. She was tall even for Sarathine, with elegant features that combined strength and grace in impossible measure. Her long ears were adorned with ceremonial jewelry that probably had more historical significance than Marcus's entire education, and her robes shifted colors in ways that suggested they were responding to something he couldn't perceive. Beside the queen, visible when the crowd shifted appropriately, stood Princess Senna. Marcus had seen images of her in briefing materials, the 7-year-old daughter of Queen Lyria and heir to the throne. In person, she was smaller than he'd expected, wearing miniature versions of royal robes and standing with the kind of rigid posture that suggested someone had spent hours teaching her exactly how to exist in public. The princess was flanked by attendants and guards, all of whom were presumably there to ensure she maintained appropriate behavior throughout 6 hours of ceremony that would bore most adults, let alone a child. She'd been perfectly behaved so far, a small statue of royal dignity. Marcus checked his chrono subtly. 3 more hours. He could survive 3 more hours. He'd survived worse. That incident with the Draxian trade negotiations where everyone got food poisoning except him came to mind. This was just standing and watching incomprehensible ritual. Easy. The ceremony reached a moment of particular significance. Marcus knew this because every being in the palace had gone completely silent, which suggested something important was happening. Queen Lyria was receiving what his briefing materials had called the crown of continuity, though it looked more like a circlet of light that had no visible source. 10,000 beings held their collective breath. Marcus held his because everyone else was, and he didn't want to be the idiot human who breathed wrong during the sacred moment. That's when Princess Senna moved, not a small shift of position, not a fidget that children do when forced to stand still too long. A full break from her designated spot, past the attendants who reached for her too slowly, past the guards whose hands went to weapons before recognizing what they were seeing. She ran. A full sprint that had her small robes fluttering behind her, her ceremonial jewelry bouncing with each step, her face set with the kind of determination that suggested she knew exactly where she was going even if no one else did. Straight toward Marcus. His brain had approximately 2 seconds to process. Princess running, guards moving, crowd gasping, "Oh God, this is bad," before 7 years of royal Seraphine child crashed into him with enough force to make him stumble backward. Small arms wrapped around his waist, a face buried against his jacket, and Marcus, operating on pure instinct that had nothing to do with diplomatic training and everything to do with being a human who'd once been a scared kid himself, caught her and held her steady, instead of doing any of the 17 things his briefings had said to do if accidentally touched by royalty. The silence that followed was profound enough to have its own weight. Marcus stood frozen, holding the princess, while his brain screamed a litany of panic. He was touching royalty without permission during the most sacred ceremony in the empire. He was about to cause the worst diplomatic incident in human-Seraphine relations. He was probably about to be executed in 17 different culturally appropriate ways. His supervisor was going to kill him. Ambassador Chen's gastrointestinal distress was going to look like a pleasant vacation compared to what was about to happen to Marcus's career and possibly his actual body. But Princess Senna was holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a universe that had suddenly become unstable. And Marcus found he couldn't do any of the appropriate things because they all involved pushing away a clearly terrified child, and that felt wrong in ways that transcended protocol. "Safe," he heard her whisper against his jacket. "You're safe." Which made no sense because he was definitely not safe. He was in the middle of a political nightmare of his own accidental creation. But she was 7 and scared and holding onto him like drowning people hold onto rescue. So Marcus did the only thing that felt right even though it was probably spectacularly wrong. He held her back and didn't let go. The guards reached them first, surrounding them in a formation that suggested they were still deciding whether Marcus was a threat or just catastrophically unlucky. Their hands were on weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, and Marcus had just enough presence of mind to keep his own hands visible and non-threatening, while still supporting the princess who'd apparently decided he was her personal safe harbor. The crowd had erupted into whispers, a sound like wind through grass, thousands of voices in dozens of languages, all asking the same question in different ways. What is happening? Marcus would have liked to know the answer to that himself. Then Queen Lyria moved, and somehow that was worse than the guards. She descended from the ceremonial platform, something Marcus's briefings had specifically noted never happened during the renewal ceremony, and crossed the distance between throne and crowd with the kind of purpose that made everyone instinctively move aside. Up close, she was even more intimidating. Taller than most humans, radiating authority that felt like pressure against Marcus's skin, with eyes that had seen centuries of history and currently held an expression he couldn't begin to interpret. She stopped directly in front of him. Marcus wanted to bow, to drop to his knees, to apologize in several languages, but he was still holding her daughter who showed no signs of releasing her death grip on his jacket. "Senna." The queen's voice was soft but carried across the silent hall. "You are supposed to be in position." The princess didn't let go. Her grip actually tightened. "Safe," she repeated, muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "He's safe." Queen Lyria's eyes shifted to Marcus, and he saw recognition flicker in them. She knew who he was, which was somehow more terrifying than if she'd thought he was a random stranger. Nobody important should not be known by name to the Queen of the Empire. "You are Marcus Webb." Not a question. A statement that suggested she'd had his file pulled at some point, which was its own kind of concerning. "The human who works in trade administration." "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice came out steadier than he'd expected given that his internal monologue was just screaming continuously. "I apologize for—" He stopped because he didn't know how to finish that sentence. "For existing. for being the person her daughter had run to, for not immediately pushing away a scared child because protocol said he should. You do not know why she ran to you. Still not a question, a statement of fact that she was reading from his expression. No, your majesty, I've never met the princess. I've never even been to the palace before today. I don't understand what's happening, and I'm terrified I'm about to cause an interstellar incident. And I'm very sorry, but she's holding on really tightly, and I don't want to make anything worse by. Stop. Queen Lyria held up one hand, and Marcus's mouth snapped shut on instinct. She studied him for a long moment, then did something that made the crowd gasp again. She placed her hand on Senna's back, not pulling her away but acknowledging her choice. We will discuss this, privately, after the ceremony concludes. She looked at her guards. Ensure Mr. Webb remains in the palace. He is not to leave until I have spoken with him. Then, displaying the kind of composure that made her a queen of an interstellar empire, she turned and walked back to the ceremonial platform, as if interruptions by children who ran to random humans happened regularly. The ceremony continued. The crown of continuity was placed, vows were reaffirmed. And through all of it, Marcus stood in his designated spot, holding a princess who refused to let go, surrounded by guards who looked like they were mentally composing the incident report that would define both their careers, while 10,000 beings whispered and stared, and probably composed the historical accounts that would forever mark him as either the luckiest or unluckiest human alive. He was leaning toward unluckiest, but the verdict was still out. All he knew for certain was that he'd come to the palace to stand quietly and not cause problems, and had instead become the central figure in whatever diplomatic catastrophe was currently unfolding. His supervisor was definitely going to kill him, assuming the queen didn't do it first. The ceremony lasted another 3 hours, which meant Marcus spent 3 hours being the most visible person in a crowd of 10,000 while desperately wishing he could become invisible. Princess Senna had been gently but firmly removed from his arms about 20 minutes after her initial sprint. Attendants, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd trained for exactly this scenario, approaching with soft voices and gentle hands, until she'd reluctantly released her grip on his jacket. She'd looked back at him the entire time they carried her away, and something about the expression on her small face made Marcus's chest hurt in ways he didn't have time to examine because he was too busy trying not to have a panic attack while an empire watched. The guards stayed, a ring of 6 Seraphine warriors who didn't quite point weapons at him, but made it very clear that he was going exactly nowhere without their permission. They were polite about it, as polite as armed escorts could be, but Marcus had spent enough time in diplomatic circles to recognize when protection was actually custody with better optics. When the ceremony finally, mercifully ended, Marcus was escorted through corridors that got progressively more private and significantly more intimidating. The public areas of the palace had been beautiful in that overwhelming way that important buildings usually were. These corridors were beautiful in a way that suggested they'd seen important, possibly fatal conversations throughout history. They stopped at a door that looked like it had been grown from a single piece of crystal rather than built. It opened silently, and Marcus was ushered into a chamber that was somehow both comfortable and terrifying. The kind of space designed for conversations that would either solve problems or create new, more complicated ones. He was alone for 30 minutes, long enough for his imagination to create approximately 17 scenarios for how this conversation would go, most of them ending with him being politely but firmly expelled from Seraphine space with a diplomatic record that would make future employment challenging. When Queen Lyria finally arrived, she changed from her ceremonial robes into something simpler but somehow even more intimidating. She was accompanied by a single advisor, an elderly Seraphine whose ears bore the distinctive markings that suggested he'd seen at least 3 centuries of history and probably had opinions about most of it. Mr. Webb. The Queen settled into a chair with the kind of grace that made the movement look choreographed. She gestured for him to sit, which he did with significantly less grace. "You are confused. That's the understatement of my lifetime, Your Majesty. My daughter has never behaved that way before." She said it simply, a statement of fact that also carried weight of concern. Senna is trained from birth in protocol, in appropriate conduct for someone of her position. She has attended hundreds of ceremonies without incident. She understands the importance of maintaining dignity, of following procedures, of not creating diplomatic complications by running toward strangers. Your Majesty, I truly don't. And yet today, during the most important ceremony our empire conducts, she abandoned everything she knows to run to a human she has never met. The Queen's eyes were locked on his face, reading every micro-expression. "Do you have an explanation?" "No, Your Majesty. I've been working in Seraphine space for 3 years, but it's low-level trade administration. Filing reports, managing shipping schedules, making sure the right forms get submitted to the right offices. I've never been important enough to even see the palace from outside until today, let alone meet the princess. I don't understand what happened any more than you do." The elderly advisor spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an accent that suggested he'd learned human languages before Marcus's grandparents were born. "And yet she called you safe, not familiar, not known, safe. That is specific language, Mr. Webb. Seraphine children do not use that word lightly. I don't know what that means." "In Seraphine psychology," Queen Lyria explained, and Marcus got the sense she was choosing her words carefully. "Children recognize safety instinctively. It is biological imperative. They sense beings who pose no threat, who can be trusted with vulnerability. But this recognition is usually limited to family, to bonded caregivers, to those they know intimately through repeated positive interaction. For Senna to recognize you as safe without ever meeting you is." She paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "Unprecedented," the advisor finished. "There are old stories, legends from before we left our home system, tales of recognition, bonds that exist before meeting, connections that transcend rational understanding. But they are children's stories, Mr. Webb, not documented psychological phenomena." Marcus felt like he'd walked into someone else's story, like he was playing a role written for someone more important. "Your Majesty, I promise you I'm just a trade liaison. I'm not special. I don't have any connection to your family or any explanation for what happened. If I did something wrong—" "You did nothing wrong. That is what troubles me." The Queen leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Webb. Not your professional history. I have access to those records. Tell me about before you came to the Empire, about your family, your childhood. Tell me how you came to be here." It wasn't really a request, and Marcus knew better than to refuse a direct question from a queen, even if he had no idea why his boring life story mattered to anyone. So he talked about growing up on Nova Terra, one of humanity's colony worlds that was supposed to be a fresh start, but turned out to be mostly just different problems in slightly warmer climate. About his parents dying when he was 8 in a transport accident that was ruled mechanical failure, but never quite explained properly. About being raised by the community afterward because no one else would take him, and the colony had policies about orphan children. About feeling like he never quite fit anywhere, like he was always slightly displaced from wherever he was supposed to be. About joining the diplomatic service because it was stable work, because he was decent with languages, because it was a way to travel and maybe find a place that felt less like temporary housing. About ending up in Seraphine space because they needed someone with his specific combination of skills. Human, fluent in 3 alien languages, willing to do boring administrative work, and no one else wanted the assignment because it wasn't glamorous and didn't come with the kind of prestige that built careers. He expected her to be bored, expected her to cut him off and get to whatever point she was actually trying to make. Instead, she looked increasingly troubled, exchanging glances with her advisor that communicated volumes in silence. Your parents died in a transport accident, the Queen said carefully. What year? Marcus told her. It was burned into his memory with the kind of permanence that trauma creates. The advisor inhaled sharply. That was the year of the delegation incident. Marcus had no idea what that meant, but clearly they did. Queen Lyria's expression had shifted into something that looked almost like pain. Mr. Webb, 30 years ago, a Seraphine diplomatic vessel had an emergency in human-controlled space near Nova Terra. Engine failure, life support compromised, passengers in danger. They were rescued by local ships, transport pilots who responded to the distress call and provided aid until proper rescue could arrive. She was watching him carefully now. The incident was kept quiet. Political complications between our governments at the time, concern about exposing the delegation to danger, a desire to protect those who'd helped from potential retaliation by factions that opposed human Seraphine cooperation. The names of the rescuers were never made public for their own protection. Marcus's heart was beating faster than the situation seemed to warrant. I don't understand what that has to do with. The vessel carried my sister, Princess Elara, who was pregnant at the time with her first child. She was terrified that the stress of the situation would cause her to lose the baby. The medical staff were trying to stabilize the ship, and she was alone in her quarters, frightened beyond reason. The Queen's voice had gone soft. One of the rescue ship crew stayed with her throughout, kept her calm, talked her through the panic, made sure she knew she wasn't alone. She credited that human with saving both her life and her unborn daughter's life, not through medical intervention, but through simple presence and kindness when kindness was what she needed most. The advisor was nodding slowly. Princess Elara spoke of it often afterward, how the human had sat with her for hours, telling her stories about his own child, assuring her that everything would be all right, making her feel safe when safety seemed impossible. She never knew his name, identities were protected, but she remembered everything about him. His voice, his features, the gentle way he'd handled her fear. Queen Lyria met Marcus's eyes directly. That unborn daughter is Senna. And Princess Elara told her stories about the kind human who made her feel safe when she was most afraid. Who represented, in her mind, the best of what cross-species cooperation could be. Senna grew up hearing those stories, Mr. Webb. They were some of her mother's favorites. Marcus felt like the floor had tilted beneath him. Your Majesty, I was 8 years old 30 years ago. I couldn't have. But your father was a transport pilot who frequently worked rescue operations, was he not? His mouth had gone dry. Yes. My sister described a man with your father's name, with your family name, Webb. Human transport pilot who told her, when she was frightened for her unborn child, that he understood because he had a young son at home and couldn't imagine anything worse than not being there to protect him. She never forgot him, Mr. Webb. She described him in detail, his features, his voice, the way he'd made her feel less alone during the worst hours of her life. The pieces were falling into place in ways that made Marcus's chest feel tight. You're saying my father saved your sister. I am saying your father saved the princess who would become Senna's mother. And that Senna has grown up hearing stories about the human who kept her mother calm during the most frightening experience of her life. About kindness shown to strangers, about safety offered without expectation of reward, about connections that matter from the moment they begin, even if we don't understand why. The advisor's voice was gentle. Princess Elara died 2 years ago, illness that we could not cure despite all our medical advances. Senna took her death extremely hard. She has been more withdrawn since, more careful, struggling to trust in ways she didn't before. But she never forgot her mother's stories. They were treasured memories, repeated often, especially toward the end when Princess Elara knew time was running out. When you attended the ceremony today, Queen Lyria continued, Senna saw you. And somehow, on some level we do not fully understand, she recognized you. Not consciously. She has never met you, does not know your name outside of today. but she saw the features you inherited from your father, perhaps heard your voice with its similar cadence, and something in her recognized the family line of the person her mother spoke of with such fondness and gratitude. Marcus couldn't speak. His father had never mentioned rescuing a Seraphine princess, had probably considered it just another rescue operation in a career full of them, had died in that transport accident never knowing that his kindness had created a connection that would reach across 3 decades to affect his son's life in ways neither could have predicted. "So she ran to me," he managed finally, "because I look like my father. She ran to you because you represent the safety her mother promised her existed in this universe. Because you are living proof of the stories that shaped her childhood. Because in a moment of overwhelming ceremony and pressure, she recognized, instinctively, impossibly, the family line of someone who'd been kind to her mother when kindness mattered most." Queen Lyria's voice was soft now, almost vulnerable. "You did not choose this connection, Mr. Webb. Neither did Senna, but it exists nonetheless, built on your father's kindness 30 years ago. Built on stories told by a mother who is gone. Built on recognition that transcends rational explanation." The silence that followed was heavy with implications Marcus was only beginning to understand. His father, his ordinary, exhausted, kind father who died doing what he loved, had saved a princess and never mentioned it, had created a connection that reached across death and time to manifest in a 7-year-old child running toward his son during the most important ceremony in an empire. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, because he genuinely had no idea. Queen Lyria exchanged one more long look with her advisor, then turned back to Marcus with an expression that suggested she'd made a decision. "Now," she said, "we determine what to do with a bond neither of you chose but both of you will have to live with, and we hope that your father's kindness continues to echo forward in ways that honor his memory." The weight of revelation settled over the chamber like physical pressure. Marcus sat trying to process that his father, who'd been good at his job and decent to people, and had died too young, had unknowingly created a connection that reached across 3 decades to fundamentally alter his son's life. That a rescue operation his dad had probably logged in 2 sentences of official reporting had meant everything to a frightened princess and become the foundation of stories told to a daughter who would never meet the man who'd saved her mother. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "I appreciate that this explains why the princess reacted the way she did, but I still don't understand what happens next. She recognized features she associated with her mother's stories, had an instinctive response, and now, what? I go back to my job and we all pretend it didn't happen. You could." Queen Lyria's voice was neutral, but her eyes suggested she was testing him somehow. "We could issue a statement that the princess had a momentary lapse in protocol due to stress. You could return to your position in trade administration. The incident would become a historical footnote, perhaps a strange story told at diplomatic gatherings. But you don't think that's what should happen. I think my daughter recognized safety in you, and that safety is something she has had precious little of since her mother died." The Queen stood, moving to a window that overlooked gardens Marcus could barely see in the fading light. "Senna has struggled. She maintains appropriate behavior, follows protocol, does everything expected of a princess. But she does it mechanically, without joy. She is 7 years old and exists in a world where everyone wants something from her or has calculated opinions about what she should become. There is no one in her life who represents simply being safe, who offers connection without agenda. And you think I could be that person? Your Majesty, I don't know anything about children, let alone royal ones. I don't know your culture's child-rearing practices. I wouldn't know how to." "You caught her when she ran to you." The Queen turned back to face him. "You could have pushed her away, should have by all protocols. Your diplomatic briefings probably had 17 different instructions about appropriate behavior around royalty, none of which involved holding the princess during a ceremony. But you caught her anyway because a frightened child needed steadiness, and you provided it without calculation. That was just basic human decency. Exactly. Her eyes were intense now. That is precisely what Senna needs. Not calculation, not protocol, not careful political consideration. Simply decency offered without ulterior motive. Simply someone who represents what her mother told her existed, kindness without strings attached. The advisor spoke again, his aged voice carrying weight of experience. The council will have opinions, Your Majesty. Many will say it is inappropriate for the princess to form attachment to a human trade liaison. That his status is insufficient, his background too common, his presence a security risk. They will argue for distance, for maintaining proper separation between royal and common. I know what they will say. I do not care. The Queen's voice had gone hard, decisive. My daughter has suffered enough. She lost her mother, has struggled to find stability in a world that demands perfection from someone barely old enough to understand what perfection means. And then Mr. Webb appeared, someone with no agenda, no calculated interest in proximity to power, no desire for influence or status. Simply the descendant of a man who helped a stranger 30 years ago because it was the right thing to do. That is exactly what Senna needs. Your Majesty, I don't know how to be whatever she needs me to be. Neither do I. That is why we will determine it together. She returned to her seat, and Marcus saw something in her expression that looked almost like hope mixed with desperation. I am offering you a position. Not because I am grateful for your father's service, though I am. Not because protocol demands it, though advisors will frame it that way for political palatability. But because my daughter recognized safety in you, and I will not take that from her when it is so rare and so needed. What position? Marcus asked, though part of him already knew this was going to upend his entire life in ways he wasn't prepared for. Cultural liaison attached to the royal household. You would work directly with me and my senior staff on matters of human seraphine understanding. You would attend court functions where cross-cultural perspective is needed. You would be visible, present, available for consultation on matters where human insight might be valuable. That's not a real position. That's inventing a job to justify keeping me around. Yes. She didn't even try to deny it. It is also necessary. The position comes with quarters in the palace, appropriate salary, security clearance for sensitive information, and when appropriate and desired by both parties, time spent with Princess Senna. Not as a tutor or guard or servant, as someone she trusts, someone safe, someone who represents the values her mother treasured. And if I say no, then you return to your life and my daughter loses something she didn't know she needed until she found it. And I spend the rest of my reign wondering if I failed her by prioritizing political comfort over her well-being. The Queen's voice was steady, but Marcus heard the underlying pain. I will not force you, Mr. Webb. But I am asking you to consider that sometimes the universe arranges connections that matter more than we understand. Your father saved my sister without knowing it would matter 3 decades later. Perhaps you can help my daughter without fully understanding why it matters now. Marcus thought about his father, who'd probably sat with a frightened princess for hours without expecting recognition or reward, who'd just done what needed doing because someone needed help, who'd never known his kindness would echo forward to create this impossible moment, where his son sat in a palace being offered a position that shouldn't exist to help a child he'd never met. There will be complications, he said finally. People will question my presence, my influence, my motivation. They'll say I'm manipulating the situation for personal gain. Yes, I will handle them. And your daughter, what if this doesn't work? What if I can't be whatever she needs? What if I make everything worse? Then we will adjust. But Mr. Webb, doing nothing guarantees failure. Trying at least offers possibility. The Queen leaned forward. My sister spoke of your father with fondness for 30 years. She told Senna stories that shaped how my daughter understood kindness and safety. Those stories mattered. They still matter. And now you have a choice. Honor that legacy by offering the same kind of simple decency your father showed, or walk away because the situation is complicated. Put that way, there was really only one answer. His father had helped a stranger because it was right. Marcus could do no less for that stranger's daughter, even if the complications were substantial and the outcome uncertain. I accept, he said. But I want it clear. I'm doing this because a kid needs help, not because I want proximity to power or status. If at any point this becomes about politics instead of about helping Senna, I'm out. The Queen's expression shifted into something that might have been approval mixed with relief. Agreed. This is about my daughter's well-being, nothing more. Though I warn you, making it about nothing more will itself be politically complicated. I'm getting that impression. The details were worked out over the next several hours. Marcus's new position, his quarters in the palace's west wing, the protocols for his interactions with Senna, the security clearances he'd need, the briefings he'd have to sit through. It was simultaneously too much and too little bureaucracy trying to contain something that existed outside formal structure. When do I start? Marcus asked as the meeting finally wound down. Immediately. Your belongings will be collected from your previous quarters and moved here. You will begin orientation tomorrow. The Queen stood, signaling the meeting's end. And Mr. Webb, thank you. For your father's service 3 decades ago and for your own service now. Neither was required, both are appreciated. I haven't done anything yet. You caught my daughter when she ran. That was enough. She moved toward the door, then paused. She has asked to see you. Would you be willing to meet with her briefly before you settle in? I can arrange a formal introduction with appropriate protocols, or we could skip the formal part and just let me talk to a kid who's probably confused about why she got carried away from the weird human she ran to. Marcus stood. No offense, Your Majesty, but I think we've had enough formal protocol for one day. The Queen's expression might have been a smile. The gardens then, less formal, more comfortable. Follow me. They walked through corridors that were getting progressively less intimidating, as Marcus adjusted to the palace's scale. The gardens were accessed through a doorway that looked like it had grown rather than been built, opening into a space that took Marcus's breath away. Plants that glowed gently in the fading light. Water that flowed upward before cascading down in defiance of physics, and paths that seemed to adjust their routes based on where people wanted to go. Princess Senna was waiting on a bench, still wearing her ceremonial robes, flanked by 2 attendants who looked ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. When she saw Marcus, her whole face lit up in a way that made his chest hurt. She didn't run this time, probably because she'd been lectured extensively about appropriate behavior. But she stood quickly, and Marcus could see the tension in her small frame, like she was holding herself back from movement her body wanted to make. Mr. Webb, Queen Lyria said formally, may I present my daughter, Princess Senna. Senna, this is Marcus Webb, who will be joining the palace staff as cultural liaison. Senna looked up at him with wide eyes that held hope and uncertainty in equal measure. You came back. Well, your mom wanted to talk to me about why you ran to a stranger during an important ceremony. Turns out you had good reason, but it was still pretty dramatic as first meetings go. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Her ears drooped slightly, distress, Marcus's cultural knowledge supplied. But you felt safe, and everything was so much, and it's okay. Marcus knelt down to her level, aware of attendants tensing but not caring. Sometimes you just know something is right, even if you can't explain why. Your mom told me about my dad and your mother, about the stories you grew up hearing. He helped her. He made her feel less scared. He was good at that, making people feel less scared. I think it's genetic, because apparently you decided I was safe even though we'd never met. He offered a small smile. So I'm going to be around the palace now, working with your mom on boring administrative stuff mostly. But if you want to talk or just hang out sometimes, that would be okay. No pressure though, no obligation, just option. You promise you'll stay? I promise I'll be here. Whether you want to see me or not is completely up to you. But I'll be around." Senna studied him for a long moment, then made a decision. She closed the distance between them and hugged him, not the desperate clinging from earlier, but a gentler expression of trust that was somehow more affecting. "Thank you for being safe," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me to be," Marcus said back, and over her head he saw Queen Lyria watching with an expression that suggested she'd been holding her breath and had finally been able to release